Hello, everyone. We'll just give it a couple of moments while people make their way into the virtual meeting room on what's a beautiful day, at least up here in Sydney. Just give it a couple more seconds. And great that people have decided to spend their lunch hour with us today. All right, I reckon we're just about ready to roll. Just get these people out of the way. Hi, everyone. Let's get cracking. So thanks for joining us for this important and I hope stimulating discussion. My name's Peter Lewis and I'm a director at Essential Media. We're the social researchers who are leading this project with Social Ventures Australia that you're part of today. Before we explain the project, though, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we join around the country. I'm on Gadigal land up here in Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the land we're all on was never ceded. If you'd like to use the chat to tell us the land you're on and anything else you'd like us to know about you, although this is also nothing that we're going to be collecting information about, please feel free to do so. And while we're recognising the land they're on, it's also important, I think, to emphasise the importance of the upcoming referendum, acknowledging the work many organisations are doing to inform their people to accept the generous invitation embodied in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So what's this all about? You've probably either answered this from one of those intriguing tiles on LinkedIn or through an email out that went through our good friends at Diversity Council. So this is effectively a giant focus group with some really interesting guests. So I hope you come along with us for the ride. Give us your insights as we go through this discussion, because what comes out at the end will really be actionable for us in building out a really important conversation. So this workshop is really being called to share information about some of the work already being done to better understand social and economic disadvantage in the Australian workplace, to better understand how your organisations approach this issue, and critically to get some feedback from you on the sorts of conversations that you think will resonate in your organisation. Like I say, this is a giant focus group with some great guests. There's no right or wrong answers in this session. But we are using a special feedback tool to help us get an understanding of your views and questions as we go through the program. So I'm wondering at this point, if you can, instead of putting your phones away and putting them on silent, if you can pull them out, Dishy will share the screen and we've got this little QR code and we just love everybody to take the code. It takes you, you guys, a lot of you will have used Menti before. So we're using that to collect our insights as we go. Let us know you're good by clicking the thumbs up. So we've got a few people there doing that. Great. We've got over 70 people in the room. So hopefully we'll get at least 50 of you sharing your insights. I'm going to give you a second more to give us the thumbs up. And then we might have a little practice. If you're using a mobile phone, you can use the link in the chat, because otherwise you end up in that bizarre wall of mirrors where you're QR coding inside a QR code, and that sends me crazy at least. Great, we've got about 30 people that have registered with their thumbs up. A few more do that. Those that are in, tell us how you got your first job. And while you're doing that, what I'm going to do, we might come up for air and have a look at those in a sec, but introduce the panel and maybe find out how they got their first job. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Lisa Folks, the Director of Social Ventures Australia's employment program. Lisa, how did you get your first job?
So first job. So back in the day, after I finished high school, I went and sat the public service exam, and I went in as it was whatever, a clerk class 1 into a local court, and really had the opportunity to learn on the job as a very silly 16-year-old, which they took on.
Great. Gary, what about you? So the second member of our panel, Gary Workman, who's the CEO of the Apprenticeship Employment Network in Victoria and the Global Apprentice Network in Australia. Gary, what was your first rung on your career ladder?
Thanks, Peter. I started as a technical officer at a TAFE, but it was, again, I think connections through friends that really got me that job, and had some really great support initially that sort of helped me find my way in the world.
Excellent. And Lisa, the other Lisa Anise, who's the CEO of the Diversity Council and a great friend of Essentials and Social Ventures. How did you find your way into the workforce originally?
Oh, well, I mean, originally after doing lots of awful jobs as a student, like probably lots of people did, my first proper professional job was on a graduate program in institutional banking, which I did not enjoy, before finding my way into a career in diversity and inclusion. But it was interesting because I think when I did it, I was the only kid on the program that wasn't a private school kid. So
wow.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
What's coming up here from the room, which is interesting, it's kind of a combo of answering an ad when there used to be ads in the paper. That's probably now something that turns up on a website, and also personal connection. And I guess thinking through the way that this room found their way into meaningful work is really at the core of this project. And Lisa, folks, I wonder if you could give the room a short overview of the project and what you're trying to achieve out of this.
Yeah, look, it's probably good background in terms of why we were so keen to engage Essential and to have this conversation. So Social Ventures Australia has been working with employers over the last couple of years to both encourage and support them to create high quality jobs for young people who face disadvantage, and particularly those young people who don't go to university, who are predominantly young people from low income families, from poorer families. So we're about to embark on 3 years of that project. We want to work with many more employers. But one of the things I guess we've really faced is that many employers don't really see this group of low income, young people from poorer backgrounds or less advantaged backgrounds as a key target group. They don't necessarily see them as part of their candidate base. And we've asked Peter and his team to help us try to figure out how to have that conversation, how to get more people involved in talking about how we can make sure that our kids have at least as good opportunities as we did and as our parents did, because that's at the heart of the idea of mobility, of economic opportunity, that it should be fairly distributed.
Thanks, Lise. And yeah, this is just one component, but I think what the project is really about is understanding what the world looks like from your perspective. And we've done a bit of research, which I'll take you through in a minute, about what we've found, but also to really frame it up in the most effective way that we can basically propose a solution to a problem that actually resonates within your organization. So the starting point to this is understanding what is the problem we're trying to solve. Dishy will share the screen again. I'm really interested in all of your thoughts on whether there is a starting proposition. Could you just let us know your view on this issue, which is, do you think Australia is an egalitarian society, a place where your family background doesn't matter, and how you think we stand up as opposed to other organisations? And as you're doing that, the numbers are starting to come through here. Lisa Anise, it's not something we talk about, whether Australia's a fair, like we like to say Australia's a country of the fair go.
Yeah.
But we don't like talking about class, right?
No, we don't. I think we're operating on this assumption that it is the land of the fair go, and we don't question it until we ask a follow-up question. It's a little bit like the assumption that we only recruit on merit. That assumes a level playing field, and everyone's operating from this inaccurate place because there's not a level playing field. But if you ask people, is Australia the land of the fair go? Everyone goes, oh, yeah, it is. And then the follow-up question is, well, where do you fit in the fairness thing? What social class are you from? And at DCA, the definition of social class we use is to look at things that are fixed about you, and things that are variable. So the fixed things, which include your, your family of origin, the school that you went to, perhaps if you had secondary or tertiary education, those family connections, and movable things such as your profession and your income, which change. But you can have zero income and be from a higher class. So, but everybody knows what class they're in, everyone. And they're actually quite strongly attached to that, even if their income and profession changes. But what we found, and we did a lot of research at DCA, one report in particular, we found that social class, so looking at all those variable and non-variable factors, predicted the experience of workplace inclusion or exclusion more than any other aspect of social identity, more than gender or race or disability or being First Nations. And that was really surprising to me, because, and the main reason it's surprising was, I would have thought it was as, as influential as those other aspects, not more so. But then the next question for me was, well, there isn't an organisation in Australia, generally speaking, that sees social class as part of its diversity and inclusion strategy. And given so many Australian workplaces are working on creating a more inclusive organisation and contributing to a more inclusive economy, the omission of social class means that we are not taking action to create that level playing field. And I think that that's something we need to fix.
Yeah, one of the interesting things we picked up in the desk research I'll go through in a sec is that Britain talks about social mobility. I think the US talks about self-made individuals. It's not that we don't have a language, it's that it's silent. It's like something that isn't spoken about at all.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's this narrative, we tell ourselves things as Australians and then we believe it. I mean, we once had a Prime Minister who said, if you have a go, you'll get a go. Again, those comments assume a level playing field. So there are, what we know, with record unemployment at the moment, there are still 3 million Australians who are either under-leveraged or underutilised in the workplace. Those people are from lower social classes. They're also from other groups, like people with disabilities and lots of women who are carers in that group. But we have to challenge that assumption that the fair go is at play. I think the reason we think we're different to the UK is that we don't have an official aristocracy here in Australia. And so because we lack that official aristocracy, we make an assumption that no other invisible rankings or social hierarchies exist that enable us greater or lesser access to privilege and therefore higher standards of living and greater income. So we have to challenge that assumption, but it goes against our national narrative. And I think that's very challenging.
Lisa, looking at these numbers, and I do note as a researcher, one of these is a double negative, but a place where your family background doesn't matter. It looks like this room disagrees with that. And thanks for everyone that's putting their details in. We've got over 100 in the room. We had 300 people register for this event. So as all these events, not everyone turns up. If you are watching the video later, you can still QR code and let us know what you think. You just won't be seeing it in the live results because we haven't conquered time travel yet. But Lisa, in terms of what we're seeing on the screen with those that are in the room, what do you make of these findings?
Yeah, look, I think it's right that Australia is more equal than most countries, but still the OECD did an analysis of countries across the world, and still in Australia, if you're born into one of the poorest families in Australia, it would take you 4 generations at current rates of social mobility to get to the average. So you start off behind, and you can't, and on average, people won't within their lifetime get that much closer to that average income. And we also see that young people who come from poor families are more than 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed at age 24. So there is no question that coming from a poorer background, your postcode actually really does matter in terms of your destination. We also see still huge differences in who goes to university, and those who have gone to university tend to do better in the labour market. However, even amongst that group, those who come from poorer backgrounds who go to university do less well in terms of incomes. They often do better academically, but they do less well in terms of incomes than those from wealthier backgrounds. So there is no question, the research tells us that where you're brought up, your family income absolutely shapes your future.
And Angela's made the point in the chat, and feel free to use the chat, everyone. She's worked for organisations who'd only hire people who went to particular schools, normally from the North Shore. What a world we live in. Gary, tell us a bit about the world in terms of more apprentice systems and how having a broader view of this can create really good outcomes for young people and for the organisations.
Thanks, Peter. Look, from our perspective and experience, we find that countries that really embrace the vocational pathway earlier in the school career, like latter years of secondary school, have lower youth unemployment and also don't complain that they have industry skill shortages. To us, there's no coincidence that you can help employers and also help young people that are going through trying to understand what their best career pathways are. A lot of our young people get their knowledge and information from YouTube and parents and friends, and don't really understand the full opportunities that are available to them. When we talk to them specifically about apprenticeships, most people can only name 5 or 6 different pathways, but there's hundreds of jobs. We've been crying out for skill shortages for a long time in this country, but I think there's a disconnection there between what young people understand and know, and then how do we actually push them into the right direction that can help with our skill shortages. And I think the more disadvantaged you are, the less knowledgeable you are in this space as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And we'll get into some of those more specific things businesses can do and organisations can do in just a sec. I thought I'd just quickly whip you through the findings of the work we've done to date. The starting point of this project was to see what was already going on, talking to people working in the field and also looking at the sorts of materials are out there. So I'm going to run you through a summary of that work. It'll probably take 5 minutes or so. While I'm doing that, you can use the tool. There's a little question tool on your phone to put any comments or questions, or like Angela and Gia and a few others who are already getting busy in the chat. If that's your preferred place, we will capture all those insights as well. So the process was not rocket science. We just looked at what's out there. So we did a landscape review and some desk research. We talked to a bunch of people that have been working around these issues, probably that first concentric circle of people that are in organisations that are engaging in this, to find out how they talk about it. And then this is the third pass, the industry testing and feedback. I'll be blunt with you. I've done lots of messaging research, but I rarely start with such a blank sheet. We are dealing with a complex issue that's driven by multiple and overlapping systemic issues and long-term macro trends. And maybe unsurprisingly, the terminology and definition is varied. On the right, you can see some of the ways that we ask people to describe the challenge, and you could be talking about totally different things. And some of it is framed positively, some of it's framed negatively. Does that matter? I guess my concern is that without a consistent and singular approach to describing the issue, we will face considerable challenges in addressing it. If you can't describe a problem, how can you address it? The second thing I'll say is, across the literature review, there's also an inconsistency in the way we talk about the who. And I think there's been a tendency to just go easy and just call it young people. And not all young people are the same, because, as we were saying before, some of them go to private schools, some of them never have to think about what not having a job is going to mean, while others have a different sense of what opportunity even looks like to start with. So on one end, we've got this broad, generic, demographic-based language. On the other end, there's a bunch of welfare language that kind of almost locks people into stories that diminish them. And in the middle, young people are referenced in the context of their educational attainment, or their current participation in the language in the labour market. As you said before, it's not this way all around the world. In the UK, employers and advocates put a lot of focus on social mobility. Last week, it was Social Mobility Day in Britain, and a lot of the big corporates really built this into their programs. We're not sure that social mobility works for Australia, but we're not ruling it out either. And it's one of the things we're interested in your feedback at the end. We can be informed by this work, obviously, although not necessarily using the same frames and messages, but we have an opportunity. I guess the upside of having a blank sheet is we've got an opportunity to build a local discussion from the ground up. If we are going to do this, I think it starts with recognising the social contract between employer and employees is under pressure. Many people we spoke to reflect that when they first entered the workforce, there was a greater sense of moral obligation amongst employers to provide training and opportunities for young people, and that in a way, the imperatives of economic realities have undermined that. The other interesting dynamic is that the generational one. Now, it's always been a case that employers and entry-level employees come from different generations, but we did pick up a growing sentiment that the generational gap between those in management and those who are entering the workforce is growing. Interviewees refer to instances of generational resentment and tension that move both ways. We've all got the, the stereotype of the millennial that wants to be CEO next week, but on the other side, there's a sense that employers blame young people's attitudes as a barrier for their own inclusion. The labour shortage of the last 3 or 4 years has been a bit of an interruption. It's presented a unique opportunity for employers to redefine this issue. With borders closed, we were forced to look at often overlooked talent pools. Embrace inclusive recruitment because we had to increase participation amongst candidates that face disadvantage. On the other hand, the low unemployment rates have amplified the negative bias that casts people who face unemployment or underemployment as the candidates that no one else wants. As per our hypothesis, class and socioeconomic diversity are not seen as part of this conversation. I think this is driven by the underlying sense we are a classless society, although it was interesting your reflections earlier that maybe challenged that. This was seen as particularly relevant amongst employers across the professional services sector, an industry dominated by university-educated middle-class employees. Once prompted, though, most interviewees agree that there's a need to confront the role of social class and disadvantage in the workplace. I guess there's less a consensus on how we name this. We looked at the sort of different types of leader categories as well: leaders, followers, and short-term thinkers. I guess talking about the leaders, the people that are front foot on this, and I suspect by your presence today, you're either leaders in this category or aspiring leaders in this category. There's a commitment to strong purpose-led and values-driven corporate culture, and also a clear acknowledgement of the responsibility that employers must create social value through good jobs. I guess the key hallmark of the leaders are that they've integrated this mission into their specific business case. The success of their initiatives depend on the demonstrable business value of youth inclusion and social economic diversity. For example, employee engagement and retention, access to alternate talent pools, and improved innovation. Worth noting here that narratives that put the blame on employers for not doing enough to create meaningful career opportunities for young people, while they might make people feel good, are not necessarily effective for driving action. I think additionally, I'm going to ask Lisa and Anise about this in a sec. Framing this issue purely through a social impact lens runs the risk of confining this work to D&I and CSR functions rather than broader HR and recruitment teams. So for any of you D&I folk in the chat, I'd love to know what you think about this, but we don't think you can do this alone. So good news, this has a potential to be a really unifying story of value and values, shifting language from the deficit to the abundance. Strength-based language is more effective than deficit-based language or welfare narratives. And our challenge is to build a story of possibility by inviting organisations like yours to be part of this journey. Recognising the barrier is really important. The reality is most workplaces don't have the right structures in place to support people who have overcome significant barriers and disadvantage. And while we know that the accessibility frame is kind of seen as part of our very important discussions around disability in the workplace, I think the barriers that we identify, we need to find a way of identifying them and moving through them the way we are with people with disability in the workplace. Only a couple more slides, then we'll come up for air. We reckon it's critical to centre the voices and the faces of the people we're advocating for, inviting them to share their experiences in their own words, providing insight into the barriers they face and critically what they have overcome. This is some of the work that Lisa's program is doing, and she can talk a bit more about that in a sec. Workers who have built careers without the advantages of old school ties or the support of personal networks should be celebrated in organisations. And finally, there's an opportunity to tell the stories of senior leaders who have their own experiences of overcoming these barriers and disadvantage by giving voice to what's possible. So that's the overview of the territory, and I know there's a lot there, and we will have a full report on the messaging challenge at the end of this project. But I just wonder whether people have got any questions. We won't go straight. Well, we come up for air, Dishy, and if there are questions in the chat, I'll have a look at those while I get a little bit of reflection from our fantastic panel. Anything stand out to you from that, Lisa and Ace first?
I mean, everything stands out. I think the interesting thing for workplaces and the fact that it's rarely a conversation in the D&I world. It's certainly not a strategic conversation. But I think that there's a real opportunity for organisations to start to, or give them access to a whole group of talent that they're currently not utilising in the economy, despite there being barriers to their access. But if we think that lots of organisations are now thinking about their ESG, how they approach environment, social and governance responsibilities as per the UN development goals. I mean, it's not mandated here for listed companies. It is in the US, and it might be one day here, we don't know. But to me, this sits squarely in the S of the ESG. We know people from lower social groups are going to be more impacted by climate change. I mean, that's just the beginning of why this needs to be a strategic conversation rather than just a reactive conversation happening at very low levels in an organisation for entry-level positions, that's very discreet. I think a strategic approach is going to be much more useful, and organisations will be more successful. There currently is a war for talent, but as we know, there are many, many barriers to people from lower social classes from accessing employment. Recruitment processes are not designed to enable those people to participate. Everything from online recruitment, which expects people to have high-speed internet and be able to do their applications in high standard English during business hours, from the way video interviewing works, the impact of artificial intelligence on those tools and who that excludes. I think that this really needs to be approached strategically, and that there's an opportunity for organisations to be much more successful if they do so.
I've just got a question through one of our guests as well. For you, maybe again, Lisa, what's the best practice to supporting or starting the conversation with businesses to start thinking about diverse recruitment?
Well, we've put out some guidelines quite recently on inclusive recruitment, which looks at who is marginalised in the current recruitment processes. And there are a couple of key principles around that, and then there's some processes we recommend. But it's really asking people to think about who are they thinking of when they think of the ideal worker. Most people have someone in their mind. That someone's usually a lot like them. So if you are already in a job, if you already have institutional power, then the people you're thinking that will have merit will be people who are similar to you. So the barrier starts at the conception of the opportunity in terms of how do we create criteria for this role, who are we designing it for? And then there are all those barriers in the process. I mean, we do have some inclusive recruitment guidelines that break this down. If you're a DCA member, you can access them fully. Even if you're not, you can get access to quite a bit of stuff on our website. But it's about reflecting on process and on bias. But it's about building knowledge in an area that people have very little knowledge in.
Lisa, folks, one of the things that you've been impressing on me is this is not just about labels. This is also about structural interrogation of the way our workplaces operate. Share with the room a little bit about your analysis of how the career ladder itself has changed over the last generation.
Yeah, look, I'll just comment quickly on the recruitment piece as well. I mean, so we run a project called the Employer Innovation Lab, where we work with small groups of employers. We look at their business needs, but also how we might create opportunities for young people for really great jobs in their organisations. One of the most powerful pieces of that is when we ask employers to bring in their job ads and show them to young people who are in that target group. And you can see how important it is, the way those ads are framed, who they're signalling, even the language. So the classic is, you put in something about logistics. Well, unless you've got a family member who's in logistics, you don't know what that is, even though it might be a job for you. So even, we saw how critical networks are to people's recruitment pathways. Many young people are put off even applying by the way those ads are framed, let alone, and we can talk more about this, there's a level of degree inflation. So people put in university degrees as a requirement to signal something, not because you actually need a degree. But in terms of the other, structural question, I mean, the world we live in today with skills shortages and with actually declining incomes of young people, because young people's incomes are actually declining relative to older people. This world is one that's been a long time coming, and it reflects a whole lot of decisions have been made over time in the public sector. I sat the public service exam. The Australian public sector employs hardly any young people without degrees these days. Public utilities used to bring in huge numbers of apprentices and train them up, and then they became the backbone of industries across the country. Many of those things have been stripped away. And if we look at the private sector, there's an increased use of labour hire, but also complex subcontracting arrangements, so that the responsibility is shifted away from those parts of the system that have the most money and power. So those things are increasing the divide between the people who have the power to change things and the people who actually are at the front line. So we really see a decline in the ability of young people who don't have degrees, because you're much less likely to have a degree if you're from a poorer background or if you've got a disability or Indigenous. So those people are much less likely than they were a generation ago to be able to get into a job, get a full-time job, and work their way through, acquire skills so that they can get a decent life, buy a house, have a family in the way that people of my generation expected to be able to do.
Thanks, Lisa. And we're just going to share the screen again. I'm really interested in if your organisation is doing any of these things which are potential ways of removing barriers. While people are filling that out, and Lisa, I'll get you to talk through this in a sec. Gary, there's been a bit of a renaissance around the notion of apprentices over the last decade, I guess, after it became totally out of fashion. What can we learn from what's been happening in your part of the economy?
Yeah, look, I think both Lisas have picked up on some really strong points there. Australia is made up of a lot of small to medium-sized businesses, and they will look for the easiest pathway going forward. And they're not very good at workforce planning or understanding what their needs are going to be over the next 5 years. Most of them don't even look past the next 6 months. So, you know, they're going to definitely need some support in this space. What we found after the last GFC was exactly what Lisa described. You know, less opportunities for apprenticeships and more people going into labour hire or outsourcing the technology overseas because it was cheaper. You know, we've got these sexy words around gig economy and all those sorts of other things, but it's not providing the same level of opportunity. At the same time, we've had university numbers grow dramatically over the last 10 years. So I think a lot of people have been a little bit disillusioned about that pathway, and we've seen older people come back into the apprenticeship system. So they're coming in and starting an apprenticeship now when they're 24, 25. They're not 17, 18, 19 like they were 2 or 3 decades ago. Unfortunately, the system's not designed to cater for someone who's 25 years old and may have some financial liabilities and things to look after. So the wages are low. The support systems are really designed for someone coming through a secondary school or a family network for those assistants. So while we're seeing more interest in apprenticeships, I think there's some barriers there that we need to improve and get governments to change some policies to allow people that are a little bit older to come through the system. At the same time, I think we also need to go back into the secondary school system and have a really strong apprenticeship pathway through that and not make it seem to be a second or a third class way of getting your education.
Thanks, Gary. Lisa, folks, people are rating themselves pretty much down the line average on all this, but you just want to talk through some of these measures just to make sure people know what we're talking about. And please keep your phone out, because this input is really, really valuable for us in understanding the world that we're having this conversation with.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just talk through each of these elements. So the first thing is around whether you're actually measuring your economic diversity within your organisation. So just a bit of an indicator, 2/3 of young people in Australia go to public schools. If you look around through every level of your organisation, one of the questions you might ask yourself is this workforce across all levels of management reflective of that? Very few organisations measure the socioeconomic diversity of their workforce, but that is something, unless we know how we're doing, it's something that we can't actually change. In terms of removing unnecessary requirements, one of the things we've really seen, again post GFC, is what they call degree inflation. So saying you need a degree to do a job where the people who are currently doing it don't have it. And there's been some great analysis in the States of this, showing this enormous and growing gap where, for example, production supervisors, they found that 67% of job ads for production supervisors required a degree, whereas only 16% of people who are actually doing those jobs today actually had degrees. Now, interestingly, that is changing in the US in a response to post-COVID labour market. They're dropping degree requirements and looking for skills, not degrees or specialist industry experience. So that's a really critical one. Non-degree pathways are the sorts of apprenticeship pathways that Gary's talking about. Again, in the tech companies, in organisations like PricewaterhouseCoopers, you see companies trying to access a wider range of talent by creating essentially apprenticeships into jobs that may not traditionally have had them. And then community partnerships, one of the most critical ways of trying to get a diverse, make sure you reach into poorer households is attracting and recruiting using community partnerships with organisations on the ground. That's what a lot of what we do in the lab is connect employers to those partners. And finally, in terms of prioritising creation of stable long-term careers. If you are part of the permanent workforce, if you are ongoing, you are much more likely to get trained, you are much more likely to build your skills over time and stay attached to the workforce over time. And from the employer's point of view, you're much less likely to leave as well. So those are the sorts of some of the key things that employers can do to try to increase mobility for people from less advantaged backgrounds through their organisations.
It's interesting, Lisa, a couple of people in the chat and here have talked about programs for disability and First Nations pathways. There is a degree of intersectionality between economic well-being and some of these other categories, right? I was directing that to Lisa Anise because I know a lot of your work.
No, definitely. I was going to mention that earlier, that, you know, no one is one thing. I mean, I'm from a really working class background, but it's also a migrant background. And that's a different pathway because there are cultural factors with the aspirational philosophy that many migrants have when they come to Australia, and the idea of the land of opportunity and giving your kids a better chance than people who might have entrenched disadvantage. So I think it's really important to understand that social class is overlaid with other aspects of social identity, whether that's disability or being from a non-English speaking background or being First Nations, and that amplifies the inclusion or the exclusion that someone will experience. And so this is complex to unpack. And it also means a one-size-fits-all approach is rarely going to work, because if you treat everyone from lower social classes in the same way, you will default to people who don't have disabilities or are white. So you need to understand the way intersectionality amplifies the exclusion. So that makes it more complex to create solutions.
One other point that you've made to me previously, I'd love to just share with this, is that if you don't have social and economic inclusion as part of your broader D&I program, you risk alienating a key group from embracing it, right?
Yeah, you do. What our research found was that if we take gender as an example, that generally speaking, women of all social classes supported diversity and inclusion, because for most of them, they understood that their experience as a woman, for example, was being addressed, perhaps not their experience as, in lower social classes. But for men, only men from upper middle classes to higher classes were supportive generally of diversity and inclusion, and that support keeps falling the lower down the social class ladder you fall. And it makes sense, because people who might, in the view of other people, have race privilege because they're white, have gender privilege because they're male, be able-bodied, are told that, you're privileged, you've got privilege. And these people who are from low social economic backgrounds, who might be really struggling to pay their weekly bills, feel and experience a complete lack of privilege. And so they then view diversity and inclusion as this elitist, exclusionary movement that doesn't factor in their real lived experience. So two things to say about that. One, that even if you, as a matter of being impactful with your D&I work, you must factor in social class. But two, as a matter of strategy, if you want to engage everyone, say you're working in the construction sector or working in a male-dominated industry, if you ignore social class, you will never be able to get buy-in broadly across your organisation, because you'll have groups of people who just don't see themselves in it and who feel alienated by it. So, it's really important, even from a strategic point of view, to factor in social class. This is something that right-wing political groups have caught onto and have capitalised on. The fact that D&I is not speaking to people from very low social classes, especially if they're men. So, and that's a misuse usually of that intention. So it's very important that we do try and build it in.
Great. Look, thanks. It's been a fantastic discussion. Now I've got to get you all to do my work for me, though. This has been a really wide-ranging discussion. It's great to get a sense of where different orgs are up to. but we're really keen to understand the best way of having this conversation for you in your broader organisation. So you're here because you've got an interest in it. How do you help us give you the language to take this broader? And we've got a couple of exercises. I know this looks really small on screen. We're going to ask you to prioritise through the tool. So Dishy will put the QR code back up there for people that have lost it. This is really important to get a sense of what works for you. I'm going to read out each of the statements. And what we want people to do is rate them 1 to 4. And then we're going to go to some sort of shorter versions of this in a sec. So here are the 4 statements that kind of explain what they're doing. And like I say, we just want you to rate from 1 to 4. So the first statement, employers need to act so that young people from poorer backgrounds have the same chance as others to get decent jobs and to build these into long-term careers. Maybe a bit of a moral imperative there. The second statement, employers need to invest in the careers of young people from all types of backgrounds today in order to make sure they have the skills they need in the future, and that they mean the employers. The third statement, building workforces that better reflect Australia's gender, social and economic mix will make for more vibrant, dynamic organisations. And the fourth one, employers can create opportunities for more young people by removing unnecessary experience or qualification barriers to their jobs. We'll give it a couple of minutes. We're getting a few people filling it out. The more the better. We've got over 50 bits of input here. Not that this is a beauty contest. The barriers one is the one that's resonating most at the moment. Gary, does that resonate with you? You were looking at your phone. You were probably entering in your 4.
I was, Peter. I was putting my questions in there.
What were you? Okay.
Look, I think there's 2 ways you could obviously look this, from the individual and community aspect, and then from the employers. I think how we sort of breach the employer aspect and what's going to actually get them to buy into the system's most important from my perspective. I think there's enough community support and interest that we need to shift the dial in this space. But I think, how do we actually get employers to start looking at this a little bit differently? And I don't want to guide people in terms of their answers, but I think, from my perspective, how we actually get employers to look at this, what's my self-interest, what's the benefit to my organisation, what is the long-term benefit for my industry, and then the wider economy overall. I think that's the challenge from my end that we've got to get right.
Yeah, it's that values v values. I want to do a slightly simpler one. This is more, I wouldn't say this is branding, but this is sort of narrow. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about removing barriers? Are we in Australia ready to embrace the social mobility dialogue that has been very effective in the UK? Is it an investment story? Is it a diversity story? Obviously, it's all of these things, but is there a sweet spot as far as each of you are concerned? Lisa and Nice, if you were betting on one of these frames, where would you be?
I think removing barriers.
The most practical, isn't it?
It's the most practical, and probably sometimes you need to create a bit of a movement of critical mass to create. So I've noticed that in the gender equality space, and you have to, and then the movement starts to feed itself. I think it's also something that everybody can do, and you don't have to rely necessarily on policymakers or people who hold institutional power. So, and I certainly think that that's important, especially when you think of how many people are employed in small business in Australia. So I would start there.
Lisa, it's your project, but did you vote? You just want to know the outcomes, don't you? We're going to go to you for a sec to talk more about the program, because we are almost at the end of our hour. But I'm a little bit surprised by what's come up number 1 with this group, but we are a special crowd.
It's interesting because one of the things that we were talking about, in the lead up to this project is the idea of social mobility has a fair bit of traction in the UK, and some of the global corporate organisations are familiar with that terminology because they operate in the UK and they feel some pressure to work in that space. So one of the things we're interested in testing was whether social mobility might come up as a hot topic, but maybe not based on that.
Well, and if you've got something better, I'll give you 50% of my project fee if you come up with the winning answer. So feel free, that's a joke, to put it in the tool as well. One more job, we won't even share the screen on this. Interested, so please fill that in. Interested also, if you're in your tool, just let us know what best describes your organisation. Are you, for this group, a white collar, predominantly white collar, blue collar? I don't know if we still can use the term pink collar if you're a caring industry, or a no collar if you're an IT industry, or if you're a bit of each. It will just allow us to analyse some of the feedback a little bit better. So that's fantastic, guys. Really appreciate all the feedback we've got. It's going to be really useful for us, including all the open-ended comments. We've got a final slide at the end that just says, if there's anything else you'd like us to know, please let us do, or just use the question thing as well. But to finish it off, I'd like to maybe get Lisa Folks to just reflect on this session, and also let this fantastic group of people know some of the other opportunities of being involved in your broader project.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, thank you so much for coming along, and thanks, Pete and Lisa and Gary, for being part of this. It's a really important conversation. Part of what we do every day is talk to young people who are themselves trying to get decent work. They can often find something, but it is rarely the type of work that will lead them into long-term opportunity and success in the labour market. And many of them just say, look, we just want to go. Right? So removing barriers, I think that, yeah, might appeal to some of them, but please be sure that that is a critical part of the conversation. But I guess I also am very keen to invite those of you who are interested in working with us and working on this issue to connect with Social Ventures Australia. We're currently recruiting for our next employer lab, which will be in Victoria in the second half of this year, but we're also interested in finding out who might be interested in ongoing ones. And what we do in that lab is we work with you to try to identify the types of opportunities in your own organisation that could be made available to young people to give them a shot at a decent work, good quality work and progression. And we connect you, we do everything we can to connect you with organisations that will help you find that talent. So please express an interest, get in touch with us. We're keen to talk with you about your work and whether you're interested in the lab, but also generally to continue this conversation, because unless employers and people like you start to have the conversation, we will continue to see young people's prospects decline relative to those of us in earlier generations. So look, thanks very much to people for coming along, and to Pete for facilitating.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We hit 100. That was our KPI. So thank you very much for helping us meet that. The feedback's been amazing. Discussion's been stimulating. The sandwiches were beautiful if you were having lunch. And have a great day, everyone. I'm sure that everyone on this list, we're happy to both send out the video of this if you want to share it with colleagues or other people in the sector. And I'm not sure, Lisa, but I'm sure there's some other parts of this that we'll be happy to share with this group of collaborators. Absolutely. So have a great day, everyone, and thanks so much for being part of this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, and Gary.